There are men who use their intelligence the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, carefully, in service of something larger than themselves. And then there are men who use it the way a schoolyard bully uses a fist, which is to say, to establish dominance that has nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with fear. Lord Marcus Thane, Viscount of Westbourne, was the second kind, though he had spent 36 years convincing himself he was the first. I want you to understand something about the Marlowe Society of Natural Sciences before I take you any further into this story, because the setting matters the way a stage matters. It is not merely a backdrop, it is a character. The Society's reading hall in London was a beautiful, cruel room, all dark mahogany and the smell of old paper, and the particular silence of a place that has spent a century deciding who is allowed to think inside it. The portraits on the walls were all of men. This was not a coincidence. It was a policy, and on the Tuesday evening in question, the last Tuesday of October, 1887, with a fog thick enough to press against the windows like a living thing, the room was full of men who had inherited their membership as naturally as they had inherited their surnames, and one woman who had not been invited at all. Her name was Miss Adelaide Payne. She was 27 years old, and she was a cataloguer. That is the word the Society used for what she did, and I want you to feel the smallness of it, because the word was chosen precisely for its smallness. She catalogued. She sat in the back room with the uncategorized specimens, the unlabeled seed samples, the pressed plants that had arrived from expeditions in South Africa and the Malay Peninsula and the highland valleys of Peru, and she sorted them and named them and cross-referenced them and wrote the identification cards in a hand so precise it was nearly typeset. She had been doing this for 3 years. She was very good at it. No one had ever said so. She had come this particular evening because Dr. Hobart, the Society's elderly secretary, had forgotten to post a shipment of correspondence, and had asked her, with the amiable forgetfulness of a man who regards all women as interchangeable furniture, to bring it round. She had brought it, and then she had made the mistake. If it was a mistake, I am not entirely certain it was, of staying, because through the reading hall door she could hear the evening's lecture, and the lecture was on botanical classification in the gentian family, and the gentian family was a subject about which Adelaide Payne had opinions. She stood just inside the door, in the shadow of a large bookcase, with her coat still on and her small portfolio of reference notes tucked under her arm, and she listened to Mr. Colin Steed, 24 years old, one expedition to his name, to the north of Scotland, present his findings on the taxonomy of certain alpine specimens to the assembled fellows with the particular confidence of a young man who has never once been told he is wrong. He was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, and not about everything, but wrong about one thing, one specific and rather important thing, in a way that would, if not corrected, make its way into the Society's printed record and be repeated as fact for the next 50 years in the footnotes of a dozen botanical surveys. Adelaide knew this because she had catalogued the very specimens he was discussing. She had held them in her hands. She had looked at the cellular structure under the Society's microscope at 7 in the morning before anyone else arrived. And she had seen what Mr. Steed had not seen, which was that 3 of his specimens were not, in fact, from the genus he claimed. She did not say this. I want to be very clear. She did not say this. She stood in the shadow of the bookcase and pressed her lips together and reminded herself that she was not a fellow, that she had not been invited, that the sensible, safe, employment-preserving thing to do was to wait and post the correspondence and go home. And then Lord Marcus Thane, Viscount of Westbourne, spoke. He had been sitting in the best chair near the fire. The Westbourne family had donated that particular fireplace, along with its mantelpiece, and the portrait of some ancestral Thane above it, and the fact was never quite forgotten. With his long legs stretched out before him, and his expression doing what Adelaide had noticed it always did during other people's lectures, which was to rest state of polite, barely contained contempt. He was a tall man with the kind of dark, angular face that painters of the previous century would have found useful for depicting fallen angels, and a mind that everyone in the room agreed was extraordinary and that he used, Adelaide had observed in 3 years of silent watching, almost exclusively to make other people feel small. He waited until Mr. Steed's last sentence had fully landed. Then he uncrossed his ankles, leaned forward very slightly, and said, in Latin, in a voice pitched perfectly to carry to every corner of the room, something that I am going to translate for you immediately, because, unlike Lord Thane, I am not interested in leaving anyone out of the joke. He quoted Linnaeus, specifically a passage from the Philosophia Botanica regarding the classification of the gentian family in the original Latin, fluently and without a pause, and then he appended, in the same breath and the same tone, that Mr. Steed's error was a natural one for a man whose reading of Linnaeus was limited to the translated editions. The room did what such rooms always do when the man with the fireplace mantelpiece speaks. It murmured its appreciation. Mr. Steed went red, and in the shadow of the bookcase Miss Adelaide Payne let go of something she had been holding very tightly for 3 years. She did not shout. I want you to know that. She was not the kind of woman who shouts. She stepped out from behind the bookcase and said, in a voice that was quiet and perfectly steady, "Forgive me." The room turned. Rooms always turn when you say that. It is the most dangerous opening in the English language. "Forgive me," she said again, "but the Linnaean passage you have cited, my lord, is from the 1751 edition." She did not look away from him. She had learned in the hard school of 3 years of invisibility exactly how much it cost to look away at the wrong moment. And this was not that moment. The classification was revised in the 1764 edition. The revision is relevant because Mr. Steed's error is not, as you suggest, about his reading of Linnaeus. It is about his reading of the specimens themselves. Lord Thane had gone very still in his chair. He had the expression of a man who has reached for his habitual weapon and found it briefly heavier than expected. "And you are," he said, the pause a scalpel, "the cataloguer." "I am," said Miss Payne. "I catalogued these specimens, personally, in November of last year." She set her portfolio on the reading table, which no woman had ever set anything on in the 140-year history of the Marlowe Society, and she opened it and found the page. The 3 specimens Miss Steed has classified as Gentiana acaulis are not. Their corolla structure and the cellular pattern of the basal leaves place them in a different genus entirely. I can give you the Linnaean citation, if you would like it in the original Latin. She did. She gave it. And the room was not certain yet what to do with this, because this was not supposed to happen, and rooms like this one, in 1887, did not have a rehearsed response to it. And Lord Thane, who was very quick, who had always been very quick, that was never in question, looked at her for one long moment, and then said, in Latin still faultless, that he was curious to know how a cataloguer came to read Linnaeus in the original. He was certain, you understand, perfectly certain, that the question would embarrass her. It did not embarrass her. She answered him in Latin, briefly and precisely, and then she did something he had not anticipated. She continued. She turned to the page in her portfolio and quoted, in Arabic, in the measured, lovely cadence of a language she had spoken since childhood, a passage from the Kitab al-Jami li Mufradat al-Adwiya wal Agdiya, the great compendium of medicinal plants by the 13th century Arab botanist Ibn al-Baita, a work that described the precise specimens in question with an accuracy that predated Linnaeus by 500 years, and that Lord Marcus Thane, Viscount of Westbourne, for all his fireplaces and all his Latin, had never once read. The room had gone the particular silent that only occurs when something happens that has no precedent. And then, because 2 languages were apparently not sufficient to the size of the point she intended to make. And I want you to understand that she had 3 years of silence behind her, and silence is a kind of pressure, and pressure will eventually find its outlet. She quoted Theophrastus. The original Greek. one sentence from the Historia Plantarum, the oldest systematic work on botany in the Western tradition, written 350 years before Christ, describing with perfect clarity the same cellular characteristic she had been trying to explain for the past 4 minutes. She said it quietly. She said it the way you deliver the last piece of evidence in a case that has already been decided. Without triumph, only with the calm of a woman who has known the answer for a very long time and has simply been waiting for permission to give it. Then she closed her portfolio. She picked it up. She nodded to the room in general and to no one in particular, and she said, "I'll leave the reference notes with Dr. Hobart," and she walked to the door. "I am going to stop us right here." Right here, in the silence of the Marlowe Society reading hall, with Mr. Steed staring at his notes, and the assembled fellows staring at the door through which Miss Adelaide Payne has just walked, and Lord Marcus Thane, Viscount of Westbourne, sitting in the best chair by the ancestral fireplace, with the look of a man who has just attempted to step on what he assumed was a floor, and discovered it was a staircase going somewhere considerably deeper than he expected. Before I take you one step further, I need you to do one thing for me. Find the subscribe button for Moonlight at Marlowe. Press it. It costs you nothing, and it means that when the next story is ready, and there is always a next story, it will come to you the moment I am ready to tell it. If you will not subscribe, you owe me one. That is the arrangement. I am very patient, and I do not keep a forgiving ledger. Now, come back with me. Not to the reading hall. We will return there, and we will see what a man like Lord Thane does when the floor has turned into a staircase. First, I must take you back to where Adelaide Payne began, because to understand what happened in that room, you must understand her father. Dr. Emmett Payne had been a botanist of the serious, impractical, magnificent kind. He had corresponded with scholars in Cairo and Leiden, and Kyoto and Bogotá. He had spent a year in Granada studying Moorish plant records in Arabic manuscripts, so old the librarians made him wear cotton gloves even to breathe near them. He had carried his daughter with him everywhere, because her mother had died when Adelaide was 4, and because the alternative, leaving her with his sister in Shropshire to learn watercolours and deportment, was a thing he could not bring himself to do. And so Adelaide had grown up in the particular way children grow up when their education is entirely in the hands of one brilliant, distracted, loving parent, with no concept of what is and is not appropriate for a girl to know. She had learned Arabic in Granada from a scholar named Ibrahim, who had the patience of a landscape and the vocabulary of a botanist. She had learned Greek from the texts themselves, the way you learn a language by swimming in it. Historia Plantarum and De Materia Medica, and the writings of Dioscorides, all of it read aloud at a work table scattered with plant specimens and her father's notes. She had learned Latin, because Latin was simply the air that botany breathed, and you did not study plants seriously in any century without it. Her father had died when she was 23, with notebooks full of unfinished work, a beautiful collection of pressed specimens, and very nearly no money. Adelaide had sold the specimens. Not all of them. She kept the ones with his handwriting on the labels, and written 23 letters of application before the Marlowe Society responded. The response had been an offer of employment as a cataloguer, which paid enough to rent a room and eat, and which she had accepted because she had no alternative. In 3 years she had correctly identified 64 specimens mislabeled by their collectors. She had written up the corrections in careful notes and filed them with Dr. Hobart, who had incorporated them into the record without attribution. Not malice, exactly, but a carelessness that amounts to the same thing. She had never once spoken in a fellows' meeting. She had learned, the way women in such positions always learn, that what she knew was not the problem. The problem was the world's willingness to accommodate that knowing. She had come to a kind of peace with it, not a real peace, a treaty, the kind of arrangement the body makes with a persistent ache, not gone, only managed. And then Lord Thane had done what Lord Thane always did. He had used his Latin to draw a line between who was allowed to know things and who was not. He had aimed the question at her with the certainty of a man who has never missed, and she had been too tired, and too full of 3 years of silent corrections, and too much her father's daughter to let it land. He found her the next morning. She had not expected that. She had, in fact, spent a fair portion of the previous evening expecting a letter from Dr. Hobart, informing her that her services were no longer required. She was in the Society's back cataloguing room at 7:30, which was her time, the only hour before the fellows arrived, when the room and its specimens and the slant of morning light through the high north-facing windows were entirely hers, when the door opened and Lord Thane came in. He looked at her in silence for a moment. She went on writing the identification card she was writing, because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of stopping. "I have been told," he said, "that the notes on 64 reclassified specimens in the Society's record were written by you." "By the cataloguer," she said. "That is how they are filed." "By you." She looked up. "Yes." He was quiet. He picked up one of the specimens on the table beside him, a pressed flower, pale yellow, mounted on grey paper, and looked at it with the attention of a man who actually knows what he is looking at, which she had to concede he did. Lord Thane knew botany. He knew it the way wealthy men know things they have studied at leisure and at length with excellent tutors and the best libraries and the comfortable assumption that their knowledge was complete. It was not a small thing, but it was a particular kind of knowing. "This is Primula farinosa," he said, correctly identified. "Yes," she said, "I know." It was mislabeled as Primula vulgaris when it arrived. Also, yes. He set it down. He looked at her with the expression she had last seen on his face the previous evening, a man recalibrating something he had not expected to need to recalibrate. "Where did you learn Arabic?" "Granada. I was 9. My father was working with the Moorish botanical records at the Alhambra Library." She paused. He believed that the Arabic botanical tradition had been significantly underrepresented in Western classification, and that Ibn al-Baitar in particular had documented species in the Mediterranean and the Levant that Linnaeus later reclassified without acknowledgement of the prior record. Another pause. He was right. Lord Thane said, "That is a significant scholarly claim. It is a well-documented one. My father documented it across 4 years of correspondence with researchers in Cairo. The work was never published because he could not find a journal willing to credit an argument that complicated the Linnaean legacy." She looked at him steadily. He died before he could keep trying. There was a silence. "May I see the notes?" Lord Thane said. "The full notes, not the filed cards." She had kept them, because they were her father's, and because they were hers, and because no one had thought to ask for them before. She gave them to him, and she watched him read, and what she saw on his face was something she had not expected. Genuine attention. Not performance. Not the careful management of expression that clever men use in public. He was actually reading, and the reading was doing something to him, and after a long time he looked up and said, "This is significant work." "Yes," she said, "I know. It should be published." "I am a cataloguer," she said. "I do not publish." He put the notes down. He stood in the morning light with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his real one, the one he wore when he forgot to wear the other. "That is a waste," he said, "of something genuinely extraordinary." "Yes," she said for the 3rd time, "I know." After that, he came back. That is the plain and perhaps surprising truth of it. Every morning, for the following 2 weeks at 7:30, Lord Marcus Thane let himself into the Society's back cataloguing room and talked botany with Miss Adelaide Payne. Not about society business. Not about the specimens she was filing. About real things, the Arabic record, the gaps in Linnaean taxonomy, the question of what it means that a 13th-century scholar in Malaga described plant species that Western science would not formally classify until 400 years later. He brought his own notes. He argued. She argued back. They were very nearly equally matched, and the mornings were the best thing that had happened to either of them in longer than either would have said out loud. But outside those mornings, in the reading hall, at the fellows' dinners to which she was occasionally brought as Lady Fenwick's attendant. He was the other Lord Thane, the one with the Latin at the ready, and the patience calibrated precisely to produce maximum discomfort in anyone who came near. She watched him do it night after night and understood it because she recognized it. She had built a version of the same wall herself. The version that looks like silence and lowered eyes and perfectly filed cards in a back room. His version looked like brilliance, but they were the same wall. She told him so, once in the back room. He went very still. He did not respond. The next morning he was back at 7:30 with a paper on comparative plant morphology, and they did not speak of it again, and she counted that as a kind of answer. The evening it came apart was a Wednesday. The society had a guest lecturer, a young woman named Miss Frances Webb, who had published a small but careful paper on Himalayan alpine specimens and had been invited to present, which was in itself unusual enough to produce in the assembled fellows the particular charged atmosphere of a room waiting to see something go wrong. Adelaide could feel it. She was standing near the back, in her usual place by the bookcase, because Lady Fenwick had a headache and had asked her to attend in her stead. Miss Webb was nervous. She was 22 and brilliant and terrified, and it showed, and the room made it show more by being exactly what it was. She presented her findings clearly and correctly, and then, in the middle of the final summary, she made a small error in her Latin, a declension, the unmistakable error, the kind of error that means nothing about the quality of the science, and everything about the fact that she had learned Latin from books, rather than from 10 years of hearing it used as social currency. Lord Thane corrected her. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He corrected her the way he corrected everything. Elegantly, precisely, with a faint undertone of incredulity that the error had been made at all. And the fellows made the sound they always made, the small appreciative sound of men who feel that standards are being upheld. Miss Frances Webb stood at the lectern at 22 years old, with her careful paper in her hands, and went the color of someone who has just understood what kind of room they are in and how much it is going to cost them to stay. Adelaide put down the notebook in which she had been taking minutes for Lady Fenwick. Miss Webb's Latin, she said, into the appreciative quiet, is the least interesting thing in this room. Her voice was the same as it always was, unhurried, clear carrying. Her paper contains an observation about the correlation between altitude and cellular wall density in alpine gentians, that is, to my knowledge, original. I have not seen it in the literature, I have looked. She did not hurry. A declension error is the kind of thing that is corrected in the editorial stage. An original observation is the kind of thing that is not made twice. I would suggest the second matters rather more than the first. The room was very quiet. She looked at Lord Thane, who was sitting in his chair. And not, she noted, looking away from her. She spoke to him directly, because she had stopped pretending, some weeks ago, that she was addressing the room. You do not do this because the standard matters to you. The standard has never stopped you from overlooking a dozen errors when the man making them had the right name and the right fireplace. She said it without heat and without cruelty, because what she felt was not anger, not precisely. You do it because it is the easiest way to remain the most important person in the room, and I think you have been the most important person in every room you have entered for long enough that you have mistaken the habit for a principle. She picked up her notebook. She looked, very briefly, at Miss Webb and gave her the smallest nod, the nod of one woman to another across the distance of a room that has been trying to make both of them invisible. It contained everything that could not be said out loud in that particular room in 1887. Miss Webb received it and lifted her chin half an inch. and then Adelaide left. The letter she expected from Dr. Hobart did not come that evening. What came the following morning, delivered to her lodgings by a footman in Westbourne livery, was a note in Lord Thane's handwriting, difficult to read because he wrote quickly and thought faster than his pen, which said in English, not Latin, "You were right. Will you come to the society at 7:30? I have something to propose, and I would like the light from the north window when I say it." She went. She went because she was curious, and because she was tired of the treaty, and because the morning light in that back room had been the happiest part of her days for 2 weeks, and she was not quite ready to close the door on it. He was there when she arrived. He had brought the Arabic notes, her father's notes, the ones she had given him, and he had spent, it was clear from the state of his desk, most of the previous night working with them. There were additions in his handwriting alongside her father's, cross-references, dates, a careful enumeration of the journals that might be persuaded to publish. "I have spoken to Professor Aldgate," he said before she had taken off her coat. "There is a paper here, a serious paper, the kind that changes the record. I would like to help you write it." He paused. "Under your name, yours and your father's, not mine." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because it is your work," he said simply, "and his, and the world has had 36 years of my name on things. It can manage without it for one issue of the Journal of Botanical Science." She sat down. She looked at the notes, she looked at him, and she said, "You were lonely." He looked startled. "In every room," she said. "I watched you. You were the most important person in every room, and you were completely alone in all of them. I recognized it because I was alone in all of them too, only from the other side." She looked at her father's handwriting. "The difference between us was that you had chosen it, and I had not." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city was beginning its morning noise, carts and cries and the fog-muffled bass note of London waking up. "I am not certain I chose it," he said finally. "I think it chose me, and I was too proud to object." "Those are different things," she said, "and also the same thing." "Yes," he said, "I know." They wrote the paper together. It took 4 months, which gave the society plenty of time to discuss what had happened in the reading hall, and what was apparently happening in the back cataloguing room. Lord Thane's mother, the formidable Viscountess Dowager, came down from Westbourne Hall in November with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has received alarming intelligence and intends to act before the situation deteriorates further. She was not cruel, the Viscountess Dowager. I want to be fair to her, as I try to be fair to all the mothers in these stories, because they are so rarely given their due. She had been a woman of considerable intelligence herself, who had married a man who required that she make herself smaller than she was, and she had done it, and had raised her son in the same school because it was the only school she knew. She had taught Marcus to use his Latin as armor. She had not known it was armor. She had thought it was excellence. She came to the society and found Adelaide in the back room, alone in the middle of the afternoon. She stood in the doorway with the particular posture of a woman who intends to be unmistakably clear, and she said, in French, which was her weapon of choice, and which she was quite certain. The cataloguer could not speak. That she hoped Miss Payne understood the nature of the attention she had attracted and the wisdom of not encouraging what she could not possibly intend to conclude to her own benefit. The implication was plain, and it was vicious, and it was delivered with the expertise of a woman who had had 50 years to perfect the art of saying filthy things in beautiful language. Adelaide set down her pen. She looked at the Viscountess Dowager, and she thought of her father in Granada, and of Ibrahim who had taught her Arabic with the patience of a landscape, and of the morning light in this room, and of what it had cost her to stop being furniture. And she spoke. In plain English, not French, so that there could be no question of mistranslation. I understand you, madam. I think you meant me to be ashamed of what you've said. I am not. She folded her hands in her lap a habit from years of training herself to be still when she wanted to be otherwise. I come to this room every morning because the work is mine, and it is good, and it has been invisible for 3 years. That is ending. I did not come here to attract your son's attention, and I do not require his name, which I suspect you have been told. I require a north-facing window and access to a decent microscope, and the reasonable expectation that my work will be credited to me when it is printed. She paused. Your son is helping me with that. Whether that frightens you or reassures you is, I think, a question worth sitting with. The Viscountess Dowager's expression was unreadable. Or nearly. Adelaide, who had spent 3 years reading rooms, caught something at the edge of it. Something that was not hostility at all, but was very old, and had nothing directly to do with Adelaide Payne. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was looking at a woman who had never once been addressed with this particular combination of calm and directness, and had perhaps, somewhere very deep, been waiting for it. Lord Thane appeared in the doorway behind his mother. He had clearly heard enough of the exchange. He looked at Adelaide for a moment, then at his mother, and then he did something she had not anticipated. He offered his mother his arm and said, very quietly, "Come and have tea, and let me tell you about the paper." When his mother, after a long beat, took the arm, he looked back at Adelaide over her shoulder. There was on his face an expression she did not have an immediate name for, only that it was warm and sure and entirely unguarded, the rarest thing she had ever seen on him. It lasted only a second before the door closed, but she carried it with her for a very long time. The paper was published in February of 1888. It was the first paper in the Journal of Botanical Science to carry a woman's name as primary author. It was also the first to formally document the relationship between the Arab botanical tradition and Linnaean taxonomy, and it is cited still, if you know where to look, in the footnotes of serious botanical histories where it belongs. Lord Thane and Miss Payne were married in April in a small ceremony that the society found deeply irregular and the botanical community found quietly thrilling. The Viscountess Dowager attended. She sat in the front row in excellent silk and said very little, and afterward, at the small gathering, she was observed for 20 minutes in apparently genuine conversation with Miss Frances Webb about Webb's Himalayan research. The expression on her face during those 20 minutes was one that no one who knew her had seen before. The expression of a woman who is learning, late, that the things she was told were impossible are not. Adelaide kept the north-facing window. Lord Thane arranged for the Society's back cataloguing room to be given a proper name, the Payne Room, after her father, which was his idea and which she found she could not object to, because it made her cry quietly into a specimen tray. He pretended not to see this, which was the most tactful thing he had ever done. Her father's paper, the one he had never been able to publish, was appended to hers. Dr. Emmett Payne's name was printed at the top of the supplementary section in clean black type, and Adelaide touched it when the first copy came back from the printer and did not say anything for a while. Lord Thane spoke Latin still. He had not lost the edge of it, and she had not wanted him to. A mind like that does not dull, and she was not in the business of dulling things. But he turned it differently now, the way a lens turns and becomes not a burning point but a wide illumination. He used it to argue with her across the breakfast table about Theophrastus, and to translate for Miss Webb when she presented her second paper to the Fellows, and to read aloud the Historia Plantarum at night when Adelaide was tired and wanted the old Greek rolling through the room like weather. He had used Latin to draw a line. She had answered in 3 languages, and he had spent the rest of his life grateful that she had, not because it humbled him, though it had, but because it was the moment he understood that there was in the world a mind that could meet his own, and it had been sitting in his back cataloguing room at 7:30 every morning, waiting in the north light for 3 years before he thought to look. And the roaring library her father had built in her, the Arabic and the Greek and the Latin, and the 64 correct identifications filed under someone else's silence. came out at last into the morning, and was not dismissed, and was not locked away, and was loved, precisely and especially, for being exactly and entirely what it was.